Hello and welcome to the first eOrganic webinar on flooding and organic certification presented by Jim Riddle of the University of Minnesota. My name is Alice Formiga and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with extension.org, pronounced e-extension. We're a community of cooperative extension service personnel, researchers, ag professionals, organic certifiers, and practitioners. You can find all of our published articles and videos on organic farming on our website at extension.org/organic_production. We'll be offering many more webinars on organic farming and research this fall and winter, and you can find the schedule along with many webinar recordings on our website. We're delighted to have Jim Riddle back with us online today. Jim Riddle has worked for over 26 years as an organic farmer, inspector, author, policy analyst, and educator. He was founding chair of the International Organic Inspectors Association and co-author of the International Organic Inspection Manual. He has trained hundreds of organic inspectors throughout the world. Jim also served on the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's Organic Advisory Task Force from 1991 to 2009, and he was instrumental in the passage of Minnesota's landmark organic certification cost-share program. Since January 2006, Jim has worked as the University of Minnesota's Organic Outreach Coordinator. Jim is the former chair of the USDA's National Organic Standard Board, and he's a leading voice for organic agriculture. Jim will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a 30-minute question and answer session. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, you can simply type it into the question box on your screen and hit return. If you don't see the question box, click the small plus sign next to the word question on your control panel to open it up. We'll read the questions out loud and answer as many as time allows. So now I'm going to hand over the screen controls to you, Jim.
Okay, thanks, Alice, and thanks for joining me today. And I'll be talking today about a subject that no one would like to experience, which is flooding and its impacts on organic farms and specifically on organic certification. And I do, as Alice mentioned, work for the University of Minnesota, specifically the Southwest Research and Outreach Center, and serve as Organic Outreach Coordinator. Some of the things I'll be covering today and discussing the source of the floodwaters, which does make a difference in terms of their impact, what some of the potential contaminants are and causes of concern, what the FDA's position is on food that has come in contact with floodwaters, and I will show some of the applicable citations from the USDA National Organic Program regulations. I'll talk about remediation a bit concerning fields and soils that have been flooded, some of the government assistance programs that are available, as well as show some resources with active links to those resources. Probably the most common source of floodwaters comes from heavy rains or snow melt. And when it's in the form of pooling, what I'm referring to there is water that originates on, in this case, the organic farm, water that either falls in rain and pools and floods a certain portion of a field, or heavy snows that melt and pool in a part of a field. And this is not at all uncommon. Typically happens early in the growing season and has minimal impacts. Also, though, when you're experiencing heavy rains, it's not at all uncommon for creeks or rivers or dry runs to overflow and cause overland flooding. And there you have much more concern with contaminants because it's carrying anything that was upstream from the land onto the surface of the organic field. And with the hurricanes that we experienced in the United States this summer, Irene followed right behind it by Lee. You had abnormally heavy rains hitting the East Coast with heavy flooding impacting organic farms from North Carolina all the way through Pennsylvania, New York, and Vermont. But now I just read in the paper today that 2/3 of Thailand is underwater due to typhoons and monsoon rains there. And then the very unexpected flooding that can be associated with a tsunami and bringing just massive debris, contaminants up onto agricultural lands. And my heart goes out to the people of Japan and the damage they suffered, both human damage as well as damage to buildings and agricultural areas from the tsunami. Some of the impacts of floods vary with the type of crop that's suffered the damage, whether that is a food crop that intended for human consumption, a feed or forage crop intended for livestock consumption, or a cover crop that was planted as soil building. Of course, the damage or loss, when it's a cover crop, it's not nearly as extreme as when it's a feed or a forage crop. But also the stage of the development or crop growth has a huge impact. If it is early in the season and the length of exposure is short, fairly temporary, whether it's pooling or overland flooding from a river or creek, and the waters recede in a few days' time, oftentimes a crop can recover, and it might be set back. It might not yield quite as well, but still can produce a marketable yield of either feed or forage, and is not adulterated because the food portion of the crop did not come in contact with the flood waters. But if the waters stay on a field or portion of a field for more than 3 days, oftentimes the crop cannot recover. The roots have been waterlogged, or the soil has been anaerobic, and hopefully the waters recede if it's in the spring with enough time to replant either with a shorter season variety of that same crop or with a different short season variety, or what's very common is to plant some kind of a summer cover crop in that area to help restore the fertility of the soil. If the one thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes when floods occur, parts of the same field or parts of the same farm did not suffer damage. And I'll talk about some of the impacts and the need to be in communication with buyers who may overreact hearing that a certain area was flooded. And I'll give some examples of that in a bit. But the source of the floodwaters has a huge impact on what the contaminants it carries and what its impacts are going to be on the organic status and the food status of that crop, as well as impacting the future certification status of the land itself. And I'll get into that more later. I already talked about the time of year and how it relates to the stage of development and the stage of growth. And I'll talk now about some of those potential contaminants that can be carried onto the farm in the floodwaters. But I want to be clear that FDA has gone on record saying that when there is direct contact with floodwaters, the food is considered adulterated. And here in the picture I have up on the screen, you see squash. This was in late August 2007 in southeast Minnesota, where we experienced 17 inches of rain in 24 hours. And it looks like those squash, which were pretty close to harvest, could be eaten, but they are adulterated according to the FDA, and there's good reasons, because they have come in contact with potential pathogens and other types of contaminants. So there are to be destroyed. And that also applies to underground crops such as potatoes that are in an area that has been underwater during a flood, and to crops that are destined to be cooked, things that aren't eaten raw. That really doesn't matter. It's not just lettuce and radishes, things that are typically eaten raw, but it also applies to underground and cooked crops as far as their adulterated status. But as I mentioned, this is a few days after that 17 inches of rain in southeast Minnesota. It also affected northeast Iowa and western Wisconsin. And the immediate reaction of some of the buyers was to cancel all orders, all contracts with organic farms in that area that suffered the heavy rains. But in reality, this is a very rugged area with bluff lands and valley fields, and the crops that were grown on the bluffs or on upper land areas did not suffer any flood damage. So it was very important in this instance for the organic farmer to work with the buyer. The buyer sent representatives out to the fields to inspect them, to take photos, and the grower did not lose all the market, and the buyer kind of backtracked and started taking food from fields where they could verify that they hadn't suffered flood damage and were not adulterated. If that's the case, the FDA does have some advice on steps to be taken to prevent contamination from the flooded parts of the fields onto the non-flooded, to make sure that any harvest equipment, wagons, vehicles don't drive through the flooded areas and then onto the non-flooded areas where they could introduce contaminants, and to maintain about a 30-foot buffer between the high water mark of where the floodwaters reached and the area that is being harvested still for human consumption. And if it's a crop such as squash or potato storage type crops, it's also just a good idea to let those crops cure for a few days before shipping them, because just the heavy rains that fell may have waterlogged the crops. They might look good still in the field, but once they've been harvested and cured for a few days, there may be some that won't ship, that won't store, and they should be culled out of the load. So some of the potential contaminants to be concerned about: petroleum. There are oftentimes petroleum tanks, either above ground tanks or underground tanks, as well as numerous vehicles that are caught up in floodwaters or washed out by floodwaters with the petroleum floating and going downstream. The same for pesticides. There may be containers of pesticides or application equipment, sprayers, storage areas that are affected by floodwaters, and anything in those areas is washed downstream. And the similar for fertilizers. Oftentimes fertilizers are stored in farm sheds. Those may be in flood-prone areas and washed down with the flood. Oftentimes the floods, and this certainly was the case in Vermont, New York, Pennsylvania, where floodwaters flowed through animal feedlots or other areas where there is animal waste and fecal matter, and that carries various pathogens with it, as well as human septic systems that are underwater and might introduce pathogens and fecal matter into the floodwater. And that's a very difficult thing to contain, detect, or prevent. Some additional concerns: the floodwaters and just the high moisture conditions can introduce molds, fungus spores, mycotoxins, bacteria, plant pathogens, so disease-causing organisms, as well as silt into the crops. And this is something certainly to be aware of for livestock producers. The issues of molds, mycotoxins, bacteria can cause even fermented feeds such as silage to not ferment properly, to interfere with the fermentation process, or even after hay is dried out, it may still have toxins and molds or fungal spores in the hay that can impact the health of the livestock. And then silt that might be trapped in, say, ear corn, in the husks around the ears, or in other types of grains. That silt can do damage to harvesting equipment, but it also is not something that is good in the feed of the animals. So it's very important, just as organic farmers need to know the adjoining land uses as far as the borders of their fields for drift and contamination concerns, to just be aware of what is upstream from your farm. If you have fields that are prone to flooding, whether it's annual event, chronic flooding, or the supposed 100-year or 500-year floods that are becoming much more common with global climate change, to do kind of an analysis of your watershed, know what the potential contaminants are upstream from you, and just have a good handle on that. If it's your own equipment or machinery or storage areas, try to store things out of the floodplain that could be contaminants to others, but also take a look and see if there are people upstream that you can work with that could remove potential contaminants. And even when you see, a very appealing looking stream or brook, a little waterfall such as the one in the picture, that even during non-flood times may contain fecal coliform due to either failing septic systems or livestock operations where the manure and feces is entering the water supply. So be aware of what's happening upstream, because we can't all live upstream. We actually all do live downstream one way or another. And these are boat houses in the Mississippi River in the Winona, Minnesota area. So now I would just like to discuss the applicable regulations of the NOP, the National Organic Program. Well, it's important to remember that one of the fundamental requirements for land to be certified organic is that no prohibited substances be applied to that land in the 3 years immediately preceding harvest of the crop. And that's typically the transition period between the intentional application of some sort of prohibited material and then 3 years before the first crop could be harvested organic. But that can also apply to unintentional applications of prohibited substances, such as contaminants that are carried onto the farm in floodwaters. And if there is extreme contamination and evidence of ongoing contamination, and I'll discuss what some of those indicators are in a bit, there certainly is a case where land may need to go back through transition, or where land, if it's prone to chronic flooding and chronic contamination on a predictable, regular basis, may not be suitable for organic production. So that's just something to keep in mind, and work very closely with your certifier to determine if that may apply to any of your land, any flooded fields. Fields are also required to have distinct defined boundaries and buffer zones such as runoff diversions to prevent the unintended application of prohibited substance to the crop or contact with a prohibited substance applied to adjoining land that's not under organic management. And once again, we typically think of this in terms of preventing drift from pesticide application on adjoining land and the need for buffer zones and preventing contamination of organic crops. But it does apply as well to contaminants, prohibited materials that are carried onto organic fields from conventional operations through floodwaters, and specifically runoff diversions are mentioned in this section of the regulation as one strategy to help prevent that kind of contact. It also, in the section describing the organic system plan, says that that plan must contain a description of the monitoring practices that will be performed and maintained to verify the plan is effective, that it's being implemented properly, as well as a description of the management practices and barriers that are established to prevent contact of the organic operation with products that contain prohibited substances. So if an organic farmer hasn't done so already, they need to take a good look at their organic plan, make sure that it describes the steps that, to their best effort, they're taking to minimize contamination that may occur to fields that are prone to flooding, as well as what they're doing to monitor the effectiveness of that portion of their plan. Of course, when floods occur, it's usually not something that was in anyone's plan, and any plan is not going to prevent the damage from occurring. But there are strategies you can take, I'll discuss later, whether it's taking flood-prone fields out of production or establishing waterways to help direct flood water so that it doesn't fan out across a field but stays concentrated in an area that's not in organic production. So the regulation also applies to handling operations in terms of the potential for damage from floods. In the handling section of the regulation, it specifically says that a handler must, and that's a processor, must implement measures to protect organic products from coming in contact with prohibited substances. So, certainly, it's not a good idea to have a processing facility, whether it's, a factory-type processing facility or an on-farm, cutting and washing station where produce is packed and, prepped for shipping in a floodplain. And it's not just that the food contact surfaces where the produce might be cut, packed, stored, graded, etc., would contact flood. But if the flood waters even get into the floor of such a building, the contaminants easily can be tracked and come in contact with the food products, as well as introducing mold and fungal spores, bacteria into the facility that might get into the ventilation system or into the water system. So it's just something else to think about. It's not just the crop growing in the field, but also the post-harvest handling area that's used for prepping and shipping crops. So the general requirements for certification state that an organic farmer must immediately notify the certification agent concerning any application, including drift, of a prohibited substance to any field, production unit, site, facility, livestock, or organic product. Also notify the certifier of any changes to the operation that may affect compliance. So this is a reminder that it is really important for certified organic farmers to be in contact directly with their certifier to get on record what fields or portions of fields, what crops were impacted, if they did have contact with prohibited substances. This part of the regulation specifically calls out drift, but in this instance, floodwaters are a lot like drift. Drift is airborne, but here waters are carrying contaminants and residues of prohibited materials contacting organic fields, crops, animals, feed, etc. And also, there may be changes to the operation that the farmer makes due to the flooding, and that means that the organic system plan needs to be revised, and it needs to be done in consultation with the certification agency. The regulations state that if the USDA, the state official, or the certification agency may require pre-harvest or post-harvest testing of any input or organic product when there's reason to believe that the agricultural input or product has come in contact with prohibited substances. So if the certifier has reason to believe that there has been contact, potential contamination, then there can be samples taken for either pre-harvest or post-harvest testing. And that also applies to any inputs that were stored and might have been contaminated by floodwaters. And the last part of that section of the regulation also says that there could be testing if there's reason to believe that the input or product was produced using excluded methods. And that is referring to the use of genetically engineered crops or other inputs. So that's really outside of our discussion of floodwater impacts here today. And if there are tests taken, reason to believe there's evidence to conduct a test, and tests are taken, and those tests show that the affected crop or product has levels of prohibited substances, so pesticide residues that are 5%, more than 5% of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency's tolerance for that residue on that crop, then that crop cannot be sold as organic. And that applies whether the crop was contaminated through drift, through misapplication, through flooding, or through fraudulent application. If that's a firm line that if it exceeds 5% of the EPA tolerance for a given pesticide on a given crop, it cannot be sold as organic, regardless of the reasons why the residues are there. There are the possibilities of temporary variances written into the regulation. There are certain sections of the regulation which could be considered for a temporary variance, but the 5% EPA tolerance that I just talked about is not one of those sections. And the use of prohibited materials is not one of those sections. But a person could deviate from their planned crop rotation, for instance, if they've suffered floodwater damage. Or there's a possibility that they could replant with non-organic seedlings if their crop has been wiped out by a flood. They appeal to their certifier, who has to asked the USDA, the administrator of the Agricultural Marketing Service, for approval before the farmer can replant with non-organic seedlings in that instance. So it's kind of a chain where the farmer asks the certifier asks USDA, USDA gives approval to the certifier, who then gives approval to the farmer for a specific temporary variance. If there is a broad area that's declared a natural disaster by the Secretary of Agriculture, that certainly would accelerate the temporary variance approval process. And earlier this year, there was an allowance granted in Texas for the opposite of flood, which is drought conditions for livestock producers to temporarily not have to pasture their animals, their ruminant animals, and not meet the 30% dry matter intake requirements because there simply was not adequate feed out there. So it was a natural disaster declared by the Secretary in given counties, and then the organic farmers were given a temporary variance from the pasture requirements. So those are examples, but specifically the types of damage that qualify include droughts, wind, flood, excessive moisture, hail, tornadoes, earthquakes, fire, and then other business interruption, which I don't know exactly what all that would include. But there is a possibility for requesting a temporary variance, but as I said, it has to follow a chain of command from the producer to the certifier to the USDA and then back down again. The certifier cannot grant that temporary variance on their own. So some of the short-term impacts. Organic crops, the crops themselves, as I've said before, that have come in direct contact with the floodwaters are adulterated. And this applies to non-organic crops as well. These are food crops. If the crop itself comes in contact with floodwaters, it is adulterated and the crop must be destroyed. The only time that would not apply is if the flooding occurred early in the season and the crop, the edible portion, was not exposed to the floodwaters, and the crop was able to recover from the flood and grow through it and still produce a harvestable yield. Some of the long-term impacts, typically, at least in the experience here in the Midwest that I was a part of in 2007 and beyond, flooded organic land does not have to undergo a 3-year transition. However, if there's evidence of persistent residues of prohibited substances, then it might. But if the waters pass through, they contacted the crop that year was lost. But typically, organic farmers have been allowed to replant the following year in an organic status. But I'll talk about some of those indicators in a moment. But that has typically been the position of certifiers. But once again, it is critically important that you remain in contact with your certifier because it may vary from region to region as far as the extent of the impact and the type of contaminants that were carried. But if there's evidence, some of the things to look for of kind of ongoing contamination that could impact the future organic status of the land and could kick in the need to go back through transition. Oily residues on the surface of the soil, or soil that when you dig it up smells of either pesticides or petroleum. If it smells of those things, they're present. They're there. If you plant crop seeds and they won't sprout, or cover crop seeds, or they die shortly after sprouting, a field might come up but then just mysteriously die. That could certainly be a sign of herbicide residues in the soil. or if the crops themselves or weeds in the crop or in the surrounding area are stunted, or they're misshapen, malformed, twisted, have cupped leaves, those also are signs of ongoing herbicide contamination, or they might be a sign of disease organisms that were brought in affecting the crop or the weeds. And the crop may appear to be diseased. That might be an indicator of herbicide contamination, or it might actually be diseases that previously weren't on the farm but have now been introduced due to the flood, or due to the anaerobic conditions of the soil because of the silt and the compaction that occurred with the flood, could make plants susceptible to disease through inadequate root penetration and root growth, inadequate air in the soil as well. If these kind of conditions occur, then it would be very reasonable for the certification agent to require that either the crop or the soil be tested for residues to try to determine exactly what's going on. But the residue testing in the aftermath of a flood is very difficult, because it's not like a drift incident where you have a pretty good idea when you can isolate what was being applied to the neighbor's farm and you know what particular compound to test for. In a flood, there's a host of different contaminants that could have become present on the organic farm. So it's much more difficult and very expensive to do a broad range of residue analysis to try and isolate exactly which one or which combination of residues and the synergistic effect of the different contaminants that may be occurring and impacting the crop. But those are some indicators to be looking for. In the long term, if there are fields that are chronically prone to flooding, it certainly would be good for the organic farmer to look into installing grass waterways or improving the riparian buffers. That is the land where the cropland joins a water course of some type. That's the riparian zone, and many times organic farmers, well, all farmers, want to farm as much of their land as they can and get close to streams or rivers and don't have adequate buffers in the riparian areas. So that's certainly a long-term strategy. As I mentioned, there may be a need to revise, update the organic system plan, and or increase the monitoring of those flooded fields over the course of at least several years to see how the crops are responding, how the soil is responding, and if there are any ongoing signs of contaminants. And as I keep saying, always check with your certifying agent to find out exactly what instructions and what impacts to follow. Another thing I haven't talked about is the very real possibility of well water contamination. If a wellhead is submerged by floodwater, there may be pathogens, there may be contaminants introduced into the well. Oftentimes that's a temporary situation where those contaminants are only in the upper portion, and with pumping you may be able to flush them out and get back to a clean stream of potable water. But if a wellhead has been submerged under floodwaters, it's a good idea to test that, certainly for E. coli and possibly for nitrates or other common and affordable water tests to know that you have potable water. If you use water in your operation, either for washing produce or as a source of drinking water for livestock. And certainly if you are a processing operation and use water in any way and that well was under a flood, make sure that that has been purged, has been pumped, and has been tested before that water is reintroduced for contact with organic crops or processing areas. Some of the things to think about as far as remediation of the soils. Oftentimes the soil has gone anaerobic. It's been deprived of oxygen. There has been a layer of silt deposited. There also is compaction and a lot of debris that's left behind after floodwaters recede. So certainly the first step in restoring soils is removing debris, and that's a huge job in certain instances. But that's the first step. But then steps to improve or restore the drainage, the aerobic conditions, getting air, oxygen back into the soil, and that may involve putting in tile in areas that commonly pool, like I began talking about, from either rain or snow melt. Those may be poorly drained soils that can be remedied through some kind of controlled drainage. But certainly increasing the organic matter content of the soil is very important to reestablish the porous structure, the tilth of the soil. And a good strategy to do that is cover cropping and growing deep-rooted types of cover crops such as the forage radish or alfalfa, sweet clover, things that send down fibrous roots or tap roots that help break up that compaction layer and get organic matter deeper into the soil as those roots decompose. Those are channels for air and water to circulate up and down in the soil. Also, they're pathways for soil organisms to be able to travel and get more air moving up and down, and water can percolate down and move back up in the soil. There's lots of other strategies for soil remediation, but those are just a few ideas. There's some various disaster assistance programs available through the Federal Farm Service Agency. You might qualify for an emergency loan. Those can be used to restore or replace essential property, pay production costs associated with the disaster, including essential family living expenses, or refinancing certain debts. So you might want to go into your county farm government offices and talk to see if that is a possibility. There's also a Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program, or NAP. If you qualify, you would need to notify the FSA office within 15 days of the disaster occurring, and then an adjuster is sent out to appraise the damage. And it's really important in this instance, if you're pursuing this, that the crops remain in the field until after the adjuster has been there, so that they can actually see and document, verify the damages that occurred. There's a similar program available for tree assistance, or TAP, which is available to orchardists and nursery tree growers. And once again, the crop would need to be inspected by an adjuster to determine the level of damage. And if you have livestock, there is an indemnity program that would cover livestock deaths that are in excess of normal mortality caused by floods or other adverse weather conditions. And there's an emergency conservation program through the FSA that would help farmers and ranchers rehabilitate farmland after a natural disaster. But then there's also the regular conservation programs available through the Federal Natural Resource Conservation Service and the local soil and water conservation districts. there may be funds available to help stabilize stream banks, repair ponds that were blown out by floodwaters, to install riparian buffers like I was talking about, or to plant grass waterways, establish deep-rooted native plants, or other types of long-term conservation practices that can both remediate the damage as well as minimize the impacts of future flooding. So, and those, the NRCS and SWCDs are all often located in the same office complex as the FSA, the Farm Service Agency. So don't just stay on one side of the hallway, but check out what the conservation programs have, but also what the disaster assistance that might be available from the FSA. Now there's some really good resources that are available out of Vermont. There's the NOFA Vermont, the Natural Organic Farmers Association of Vermont has put together some frequently asked questions and answers, not just the questions, but a very good common sense fact sheet there. There's also from the University of Vermont Extension has put together some very good resources. There's a food safety advisory that talks about the contaminated food. It's geared more towards consumers, but it also has some good pointers for farmers, especially to think about if you do post-harvest handling and on-farm processing. But they also have a good fact sheet on managing flood-damaged crops, kind of what to be looking for, what how you can use those crops or not use those crops, what some of the dangers are. NOFA Vermont has a list of flood resources at the top website here, and another one from University of Vermont Extension on specific to damages that occurred after Tropical Storm Irene. And then they have one on geared towards commercial produce growers. And this is the final page now of my presentation. Article I wrote after the floods we suffered in 2007, impacts of flooding on organic food and fields. And after this presentation, I intend to update that with some of the information and links that I've included in this webinar. And then, Montana and North Dakota suffered extensive flooding earlier this year, and Senator John Tester, an organic farmer from a state of Montana, who's also a U.S. Senator, put together some links to this website from the Federal Emergency Management Agency about disaster assistance. So I'll close there and would be happy to try and answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Jim. We're about to start our question and answer period, and for anyone who missed the beginning of the presentation, you can use the question box on your screen to type in questions and hit return. If you don't see the question box, you can click the small plus sign next to the word question to open it up. We'll be reading the questions out loud, and we'll answer as many as we have time for. Several people have asked already if the webinar is being recorded, and yes, it is being recorded, and it will be posted within the coming week on our website on eOrganic under archived webinars, actually under a link called Webinars by eOrganic from our homepage. If after the webinar, if you have additional questions or questions that haven't been answered, you're welcome to use the online Ask an Expert system at extension.org/ask. Here's the link right here. And we also really value your feedback on our webinars, so we'd very much appreciate it if you could fill out our follow-up survey, which you'll be receiving in an email later today. So now let's move on to the questions. First question, does the FDA distinguish between heavy rain flooding and overland flooding from rivers and streams?
Well, from what I can tell, they don't. They don't. It's not, and that article that I showed a link to that I wrote several years ago does have the FDA, a footnote with the FDA's definition of adulterated food and links to the FDA, positions or documents, and they really don't distinguish between overland flooding or flooding from pooling. They just talk about contact with flood waters. So that's unfortunate, but in my mind there should be a difference. If the water, fell on the organic farm and didn't carry any contaminants from off-site, you have a pretty good idea that at least it's not going to be introducing pesticide residues. But there is the impacts of pathogens that can form from the high moisture conditions. So there are very real concerns. But it might be different. It might not be pesticides and petroleum or fecal matter from a feedlot, but it could just be the abnormally high moisture conditions can breed disease, and molds, fungus, bacteria can propagate in those conditions.
Okay, we have a question about testing. Since, as you mentioned, testing is expensive, is there a recommended test for flooded areas? For example, if a certifier wanted to test for flood contaminants, would coliform testing be the best first step if potential contaminants are unknown?
Yes, I think that certainly would be the best first step, because that's the most common fecal coliform. It would be an indicator that other contaminants came, and is cheap, readily available, and so it certainly would be a good first step.
Okay, this question has several parts. Who takes precedence between the FDA and the State Organic Commission regarding controlled flooding on underground crops such as carrots, beets, and potatoes, or any crops that may come in contact with river water as the controlled irrigation source?
Okay. I'm trying to kind of sort out that question in my mind before I answer it. The FDA, in my understanding, has jurisdiction if the crops have been flooded, have come in direct contact with flood waters. Then it doesn't matter what happens, whether it's organic or not. And so a state official or an organic certification agency are not going to be able to overrule the FDA if they determine that an area, a field, or a crop has been flooded, come in contact, that is adulterated. Of course, the FDA doesn't have personnel out in the countryside. It's more a ruling that is issued, and it needs to be followed. And if food is sold in violation of that, and people get sick, well, everybody suffers then. So I think that certainly it's a huge loss for all involved, but there is common sense here. This is contaminated food, or there is a strong possibility that it is contaminated and adulterated and should be discarded. There is just too high a risk, and so there's a margin of error where some crops, as I mentioned, in that 30-foot buffer zone around the flooded area, where they weren't directly contacted, but you are better safe than sorry, a precautionary approach of not harvesting things that were close to the high water mark of the floodwaters. But yeah, a state official or a certifier is not going to be able to say that oh, wait a minute, even though these were contaminated or came in contact, they think they're okay. No, I think the FDA has precedence here.
Okay, we had a couple questions about the resources. People wanted a longer time to look at these resources, so I'm going to keep putting the resource slides up and sort of move slowly here so that people have time to copy them down. And then also, several people wanted to know if the slides for the webinar will be available. And I think we talked about posting them as a PDF on the same page with the webinar recording. So that will be available. But meanwhile, I'll just move along very slowly with these resources so that people can have a better chance to look at them or copy them down. So I'll continue on with the questions. Oh yeah, here's a comment about the FSA NAP program. It says you usually need to sign up for FSA NAP by a specified date, which is usually in the spring, which may be prior to the loss from flooding.
Right.
And if you're not signed up, then you would not obtain any funds. And also the NAP program only covers crops not covered by the federal crop insurance program.
Right, non-insured crops, right. But
right.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. Sorry if I didn't make that clear. But yes, the person does need to register in advance and the possibility of a flood occurring. And then if you are covered, then you have to notify them within 15 days and have the adjuster come out, et cetera, as I described.
Okay. Hi, Jim. This is Lois Christie. Hi, Lois. I have a question with regard to EPA tolerances, about the 5% tolerance.
Yeah.
An organic product was tested and showed positive for a pesticide not registered for the organic product, which was peppers. Does this mean the EPA tolerance level is 0, or do they use the tolerance level of the intended product, such as corn, wheat, or sorghum?
Okay, so as I understand the question, it's a residue of a pesticide being present that is not registered for that crop, for peppers in this instance. Well, that's there's no tolerance. Zero. The tolerance is 0 there. Whether that pepper is organic or conventional, it has the presence of a non-registered pesticide, and that's a violation. That's adulterated under EPA. Has nothing to do with flooding, but that pesticide is not registered for that crop, so any presence is a violation, and that has nothing to do with the 5% for organic use. That 5% only applies to residues of registered pesticides for that crop. So if a test shows up something that's not registered for that crop, that already is a violation, just because that pesticide is being found where it's not allowed to be used.
Okay.
And that may stir a controversy, but that's certainly my understanding of the pesticide registration laws.
Okay, next question. Do any of the disaster aids cover the economic loss from losing the organic integrity of your farm? In other words, if your farm has to return to transition after a flood?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't have a firm answer. There now is, under federal crop insurance, there are provisions for both transitioning and organic farmers to be able to get federal crop insurance. And now for certain crops, they even can be covered at the organic value of the crop. So if they suffer losses and they have coverage under that program, my assumption is it would cover the loss at the organic market price. However, I haven't heard of any of the insurance that extends to future years that would cover, a loss if the land is contaminated and has to go back through transition, that would cover the loss of that organic premium or the crops grown in those ensuing years that could no longer be sold as organic. But that's something to discuss with your FSA officials, or specifically with the insurance agent who provided the coverage under the organic program that is available through federal crop insurance now. But that's certainly a good thing to look at. But as far as I know, it's not available that extends into the future.
Okay, here's a question. from a farmer, will my organic farmland be able to maintain its organic status if it is to be used as a water retention staging area for a local municipality for spring-summer flooding events?
So, if I'd have to, try and envision what he's asking or she is asking about, and it would seem that the land is not going to be part of a reservoir, not going to be flooded because it would no longer be farmland in that instance, but it might be in a part of a flood control structure that if there are abnormally heavy rains in the area or upstream, it could be backed up and be flooded because of the location. And boy, that's a tough one, but it would be very hard to see where land like that could, it depends on how often that flooding occurs, but that's increasing the likelihood that it will be flooded. It's not just the river overflowing, but it's water backing up from downstream and pushing the waters back onto the farm. And if that is used frequently, that's going to be a chronic problem. That's like a low-lying field that gets flooded 1 out of 3 years, and may be better in some kind of a set-aside program, or may not be reliable as far as being available for organic crop production. It might be suitable for pasturing. That might be a good use, but for vegetables or something like that, I think that would be pretty risky. But once again, talk to your certifier. Show them the maps, whatever the agreement is or the conditions are. Make sure that's described in the organic plan, and make sure that the inspector who visits the farm fully understands the situation, and they're going to help you sort that out. But it may not be favorable. It sounds like an unfortunate situation.
Okay, I just posted a link in everybody's chat box for more resources on flooding from the University of Vermont. We got a comment from the University of Vermont that referred us to those. So everybody wants to copy those links. You can find even more information from them. And also another comment about that, in Vermont, the FSA office has encouraged all folks, whether registered or not, with flood-damaged fields to apply for ECP funds following Hurricane Irene.
And that's the Emergency Conservation Program. And that is one where you don't have to have had insurance. But the emergency funds made available for conservation practices. And yeah, the same thing happened here in Minnesota after 2007 floods. And in fact, here the state legislature made a special appropriation that the conservation districts had additional funds available for stream bank repairs and pond repairs and emergency conservation measures. So there may be additional resources through their state or local government in addition to that FSA program.
Okay. Would composting and reusing contaminated crops for soil improvement be an acceptable method of destroying contaminated produce for the EPA?
Yeah, and this is my opinion. Once again, check with your certifier, but yes, adulterated crops or contaminated feed, certainly that would be a good way to recycle those nutrients is through composting. And under the organic regulations, all of the compost feedstocks don't have to come from certified organic sources. Animal manure from conventional farms can be used in feedstocks for a compost operation, or crop residues from conventional farms can be used. So it would make sense to me that the crops and crop residues that had been suffered from flooding, that composting those and making sure that it is actively composted, not just piled and let rot, but that it does have the proper carbon to nitrogen ratio, and that it does heat up and is turned and thoroughly mixed so that the pathogens are destroyed in the heating process, and it's not going to break down any heavy metals that might have been introduced, but it will break down hydrocarbons. So the petroleum will break down. Some of the pesticides might break down, and certainly the pathogens, it will help break those down. So that certainly is a good strategy. But once again, lay out your plan to your certifier and seek guidance there. And I don't know if some of those Vermont Extension resources go into composting, but that is an area I think that should be looked at.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understand this question. I think it says, why the 30-foot buffer for floodwaters as opposed to a 25-foot buffer according to the National Organic Program?
Well, the National Organic Program doesn't set a buffer size of 25 feet. That's a common misunderstanding, and many private certifiers used to have a minimum buffer distance of 25 feet. But under the NOP, it's all site-specific, dependent on risk. So in some instances, no buffer is needed. In other instances where an organic vegetable farm is next to a conventional orchard where there are air blast sprayers that are used and tall trees and the likelihood of drift is higher, a 25-foot buffer is not adequate. There may be a wider buffer needed, or if you have a hedgerow and physical obstructions in the way, the buffer can be smaller. So there actually is no minimum buffer width stated in the NOP regulation. It's up to the producer in their organic plan and with their farm maps to identify which borders are susceptible to potential contaminants and what they propose as an adequate buffer, and then the inspector reviews that, and the certifier makes a determination of what is adequate. But it's a case-by-case determination, not a standard one-size-fits-all from the federal government.
Okay. Any thoughts about what to do when floodwater may include residues from pesticides that do not have EPA tolerances, like lawn pesticides?
Well, pretty much what I've talked about applies, whether those pesticides have are registered for use on a particular crop or not. As it affects organic, they're prohibited substances. If there's tests taken, that's when that registration kicks in as far as the 5% of the EPA registered tolerance, like we discussed earlier. But yeah, that's a whole other area of contaminants that I didn't discuss is pesticides coming from golf courses or from urban, suburban, or rural lawns, for that matter, that are not at all registered for contact with food crops. I think that's just one of the other reasons why FDA says these are adulterated crops and can't be consumed.
Okay. Does the EPA hazardous waste remediation get involved in cleaning up farmland after a flood?
I don't know. That's beyond my area of experience and expertise. That might be something to look into.
Let's see, we have time for a couple more. Is the FDA stance on flooded crops new in 2011? It seems with past flood, more decision-making has been left to the farmer, specifically with root crops, for example, or is there just a new climate in regard to food safety now?
Well, there's certainly more awareness. The Food Safety Modernization Act was passed and is still being implemented. But no, this was their position in 2007. So this is nothing new as far as contact resulting in those crops being adulterated. I don't know how long it's been their position because I first looked into this when I had to, which was when this area suffered flooding. So, but it's been that way for 4 years, at least.
Okay. What are your recommendations before becoming involved in an organic vegetable operation in a known floodplain?
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, I would look for land that's not prone to flooding, or if there's any way to, have. I mean, it can be quite expensive and to build a dike or diversion. But if there's any way to isolate certain fields from the likelihood of floods, then those might be, worth putting all the time, effort it takes to build the soil, to set up irrigation, to go through transition. That is quite an investment of both money, resources, time, labor, but to do that in land that is known to be prone to flooding, I think is almost foolhardy. If it can be avoided at any cost, I think looking for a little higher ground is certainly wise. And I don't think, flooding is going to diminish in the coming years. If anything, it's going to become more extreme. So I have a good friend of mine who did suffer damage in the floods, and he's essentially relocated his farm to higher ground because, it's just heartbreaking, and you lose so much, and it's really hard to recover from. But if you're just setting up, I would really take the time to, find land that is protected and also, well drained, and then go to the conservation office, do what you can as far as putting in grass waterways and buffer strips along any streams, but also catch ponds, diversions, things to protect you from even water that falls above ground, to slow that so it percolates and becomes groundwater rather than rushing over the organic fields.
Okay, well, we're running out of time, but I'd like to thank you all for your questions. And as I mentioned before, if you have additional questions, you can use the Ask an Expert system at extension.org/ask. The link is on the screen. The webinar will be posted on the eOrganic website at extension.org/organic_production, and there's a link there that says Webinars by eOrganic, and you can find all of our recorded webinars as well as all of our upcoming webinars. You may want to join us next week. We have a webinar on plant breeding for organic systems on October 18th. Thank you so much for coming again today, Jim, and thank you all for joining us.
Yes, thank you.